Picture a beach on the Arabian Sea. The morning of April 6, 1930, an old man in a plain white cloth walks down to the waterline. Behind him, thousands of people. Behind them, a nervous empire. He has walked 24 days and something like 240 miles to get here, from an ashram near Ahmedabad to a small coastal village called Dandi. And now he stops and he bends down and he picks up a lump of salt left by the evaporating tide. That's it. That's the whole crime. Because in British India in 1930, an Indian could not legally do what that man just did. You could not scrape salt off your own shore. You could not boil it out of your own seawater. By law, salt came from the government at the government's price with the government's tax on it, or it did not come at all. So think about what it takes to build a world where picking up salt is an act of rebellion. Salt is not gold, it's not oil. It is the cheapest, most ordinary substance on earth, and it is the one mineral a human body cannot survive without. You will die without it. And precisely because you cannot refuse it, empires spent 2,000 years discovering that it was the perfect thing to tax. The question is not why Gandhi bent down to pick up that salt. The question is why an empire on the other side of the planet had made it illegal, and why so many empires before it had done exactly the same thing. Let's go back. Not decades, millennia. China, 81 BCE. The Han court holds a formal debate and someone writes it down. That text survives, the Yantielen, the Discourses on Salt and Iron, compiled by a scholar named Huan Quan early in the 1st century BCE. It records an argument between two sides of the government over who should control the necessities of life. And the fact that they bothered to argue tells you the stakes were already enormous. Here's how it got to that point. A few decades earlier, the Emperor Wu, Han Wudi, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, had a war to pay for, a long, grinding series of campaigns against the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation on the northern frontier. Wars are expensive, so around 119 BCE, Wu's government took the salt and the iron trades and made them state monopolies. From now on, the state would produce the salt, or license it, and keep the profit. Notice the logic, because you're going to see it again and again. The state didn't invent a new tax and announce it. It took something people already had to buy, stepped into the middle of the transaction, and skimmed salt was one instrument among several. The Han also debased the coinage and squeezed the merchants, so this was never a single lever. It was one of the most reliable, and it was reliable for a reason someone had spelled out centuries before. There's an old Chinese treatise, the Guanzi, traditionally attributed to the minister Guanzhong, though that attribution is disputed, and the version we have was compiled later, in the Han period itself. Whoever wrote it laid out the principle with startling honesty. Tax, salt, it argues, because the people cannot escape it. Raise the price of grain and people eat less grain. Raise the price of salt and people pay, because there is no substitute and no way to do without. It is, in effect, a tax on being alive, and it collects itself. That is the whole idea of this story, written down in China more than 2,000 years ago. So what was the debate about? By 81 BCE, the war emperor was dead, and under his young successor, the court sat down to argue whether the monopolies should continue. On one side, the Confucian scholars, the literati, who attacked the monopolies as the state grubbing for profit, squeezing ordinary people and feeding the machinery of war. On the other, the central officials, led by the Lord Grand Secretary, a man named Sang Hongyang, who defended state control of trade and profit as the thing that kept the empire solvent and its armies fed. Here's the strange part. We don't cleanly know who won. The sources disagree on the exact outcome. Some say the court repealed only the state monopoly on alcohol and kept salt and iron. Others describe a temporary rollback of the iron monopoly. What isn't in dispute is the longer trend. Salt kept supplying a major share of government revenue for centuries after. The scholars made their speeches. the salt tax stayed. And notice what salt is at the end of Act 1. It is a line in an imperial budget, a fiscal instrument owned by a state defended in open court by name. Remember that, because over the next 2,000 years that budget line is going to travel and change, and eventually turn on the very powers that leaned on it. Now move west and forward to France. Here the mechanism gets crueler. The French crown's salt tax has a name that still makes historians wince: the Gabelle. Its origins are genuinely disputed. Popular accounts pin a permanent salt tax on King Philip VI, dated precisely to 1341. The more careful reading says something looser, that Philip VI was pulling extraordinary revenue from salt and other levies around 1340 and 1341, but that the tax became permanent by a royal ordinance in 1360 under John II, and only came to mean specifically the salt tax in the century after. Either way, by the end of the Middle Ages, the French crown had done what the Han did, planted itself in the middle of everyone's salt. But the French added two twists that made the Gabelle infamous. The first twist was geography. The tax wasn't one tax, it was a patchwork. There were the Pays de Grande Gabelle, the heartland provinces around Paris, where the price of salt was crushing. There were the Pays de Petite Gabelle in the southeast, where the rate ran lower. And there were the exempt regions, Brittany, parts of Flanders, and the southwest, territories that had negotiated their way out when they came under the crown and paid little or nothing. So the price of the same white grains depended entirely on which side of an invisible line you stood on. In the high tax zone, salt could cost something like 10 times what it actually cost to produce. Now sit with what that does to a map. A day's walk could separate cheap salt from ruinous salt, and the moment you create that kind of gap, you create a business, smuggling. The French called the smugglers faux sauniers, the false salt carriers, and they moved salt out of the cheap zones and into the expensive ones by the ton. The crown answered with special courts and savage punishments, the galleys, even death for the worst offenders. Britannica confirms the basic picture: a high, uneven tax that provoked widespread contraband. The exact body count you'll sometimes see quoted, thousands sentenced every year, comes from lighter sources, so hold it loosely, but the shape is clear. The government had made salt so expensive that it turned ordinary people into criminals, and then hanged them for it. The second twist was worse, because it removed even the choice to go without. In the Grande Gabelle zone, there was an institution called the Sel du Devoir, salt of duty. Every person above a certain age had to buy a fixed minimum quantity of salt every year, from the state at the state's price, whether they needed it or not. The specific figures you'll see, around 7 kilograms a year from the age of 8, rest on reference sources rather than hard archival proof, so treat the numbers as approximate. But the principle is documented, and it is breathtaking. This was not a tax on what you bought. This was a law that you must buy. And who was exempt? The nobility, the clergy, certain other privileged persons, Britannica says so plainly. The people who could most afford salt were excused from paying for it, and the people who could least afford it were legally compelled to. So here is salt at the height of the ancient regime. Not just a budget line anymore, but a boundary line, a daily, physical marker of who mattered and who didn't. When the revolution came, the National Assembly abolished the Gabelle in early 1790 and pardoned those convicted of salt smuggling, a telling thing to do in the opening months of a new order. Napoleon brought the tax back around 1806, by some accounts 104. France didn't finally kill it until 1945 or 1946, depending on the source. But let's be careful here, because it's the easiest mistake in this whole story to make. The Gabelle did not cause the French Revolution. The revolution came out of a pileup, a bankrupt treasury, bad harvests, a rigid system of noble and clerical privilege, a political crisis the monarchy couldn't manage. The salt tax was one grievance stacked among many. What historians can say, and what recent economic work at Harvard has tried to measure, is that this kind of extractive taxation tracked with rising discontent, that where the crown squeezed hardest, people resented it most. That's an interpretation, not a verdict. Salt didn't topple a throne, but it was one of the stones under it. We've watched salt as a tax. Now watch it become something stranger, something closer to money itself. Cross the Sahara. Head to West Africa, to the belt of empires that rose along the southern edge of the desert. Ghana, then Mali, then Songhai, running roughly from the 6th century through the 16th. These were among the richest states on earth, and their wealth flowed along a single trade, salt going south, gold coming north. Here's the geography that made it work. The gold lay in the south, in gold fields like Bambouk and Wangara. The salt lay in the desert to the north, hacked out of dead lake beds at mining settlements like Tagaza, in what is now Mali, which supplied West Africa with salt right up to the 16th century. And the two things each side wanted most, the other side didn't have. The people of the gold country had all the gold they could dig, but no salt in a climate where you sweat it out and sicken without it. The desert had salt in slabs, and no food and no gold, so they traded, and whoever sat between them, controlling the road, got rich. The scale is worth picturing. At Tagaza, they cut the salt into enormous slabs up to around 90 kilograms each. A camel carried 2. And the caravans that crossed the desert ran from 500 camels to several thousand, roped together, hauling a mineral that grew more valuable the further south it went. One estimate has a 90-kilo block of salt floated down the Niger from Timbuktu to Djenné, roughly doubling in value, up to something like 450 grams of gold. That's a single source and a single figure, so take it as an illustration, not a law. But the direction is right. Every mile from the mine, the salt got more precious. You've probably heard the punchline of this story that in West Africa, salt traded for gold weight for weight. Be careful with that one. It's a great line, and it's mostly a myth. The careful version is narrower. In some remote places, in some periods, the rate approached parity by weight. Not as a rule, salt was extraordinarily valuable, but it was not a universal ounce-for-ounce swap for gold. However often you'll hear it said. There's another famous story here too, the silent trade. Buyers and sellers, so the tale goes, who never met face to face. One side laid out salt and withdrew. The other laid out gold beside it and withdrew. Back and forth until both were satisfied. No words exchanged. It's a wonderful image. It's also a legend, a story told about exotic commerce since Herodotus, thin on documentation, and historians treat it with real skepticism, worth telling, not worth believing. Now here's the part that ties this act to everything else. What did the empires actually do with this trade? They taxed it, and we have it in writing from a primary source. The geographer al-Bakri, writing in 1076, records that the kingdom of Ghana taxed salt twice over, 1 gold dinar on every load that entered the country, and 2 dinars on every load that left. Read that again. Import and export, coming and going. The most reliable statement in this entire story that power taxes the indispensable comes not from China or France, but from an 11th century description of Ghana and its coming and going, so watch what salt has become by the end of Act 3. In China, it was a budget line. In France, it was a boundary line. Here, in West Africa, it's practically a currency, a substance so valuable it structured trade routes, filled the treasuries of 3 successive empires, and got taxed at both ends of the road. And a quick, necessary caution, it wasn't salt that built these empires. It was rulers and merchant networks who understood that whoever controlled a scarcity everyone needed could tax the flow. And much of the labor that dug the salt out of Tagaza was forced enslaved people working the mines. The wealth was real, so was the coercion beneath it. Which brings us back to where we started, India, and the empire that would push this old idea one step too far. The British salt monopoly in India wasn't built in a day, and it wasn't built to a plan, it accreted. After the Battle of Buxar in 1764, the British East India Company controlled the revenues of Bengal in 1772. Warren Hastings brought the salt trade itself under the company. Rates climbed, and over time, the wholesale price of salt rose sharply, roughly threefold by some accounts, though the precise rupee figures come from lighter sources, so hold the exact numbers loosely. The academic picture is solid on the shape of it. The company built a salt monopoly. Hastings pulled the trade under state control in 1772, and the burden on ordinary Indians grew, and it grew into serious money. By the middle of the 19th century, salt was supplying a substantial slice of Indian revenue. One much-quoted estimate puts it near 10% around 1858, though that figure traces to a single researcher, and academic work gives different denominators, so treat it as an estimate rather than a settled fact. Either way, the monopoly hardened into law. The India Salt Act of 1882 made it explicit. Indians could not gather or manufacture salt on their own, could not sell it freely, and had to buy it from the government and pay the salt tax. The empire had put a fence around the ocean. And here's the moment where that empire showed its hand. And I want to be precise, because the record here is unusually good. It comes straight from the transcripts of the British Parliament. In 1923, the colonial government's finance member proposed doubling the salt tax from 1 rupee 4 annas to 2 rupees 8 annas per maund, about 82 pounds of salt. The Indian Legislative Assembly voted it down, and the Viceroy, Lord Reading, pushed it through anyway over the Assembly's rejection on his own authority. The rate was rolled back the next year, but the lesson landed. When Indians used the legal machinery to refuse a salt tax, the machinery was simply overruled. Now understand why salt, of all things. The salt tax was regressive. It fell hardest on the poorest, because in a hot climate where the body loses salt and craves it, the poor spent a larger share of what little they had just to stay standing, and it fell on everyone. That's the part a man named Gandhi understood better than the government did. Salt didn't care about religion or caste or region. Hindu and Muslim, high caste and low, north and south, everyone ate it, everyone needed it, everyone paid the tax. Historians read Gandhi's choice as deliberate, and his own words back it. He wanted a grievance that belonged to all of India at once. Salt was it. So on March 12, 1930, he walked out of the Sabarmati ashram near Ahmedabad with a few dozen companions at the start, down toward the sea, 24 days, around 240 miles. And the walk itself was the point, because every village he passed through, every reporter who followed, every day the column grew longer. Was another day the whole world watched an old man walking to the ocean to commit the crime of making salt. On April 6th, at Dandi, he reached down and lifted it out of the mud. And then the country did the same. It spread, Indians up and down the coast boiling seawater, scraping up salt, breaking the law by the millions. By the end of 1930, something like 60,000 people were in prison. In May, at the Dharasana Salt Works, colonial police clubbed ranks of nonviolent protesters who would not raise a hand to defend themselves, and a Western correspondent cabled the scene out to the world. Those reports did something the marchers alone could not. They made the empire's authority look not powerful but brutal and small. Let's be honest about cause and effect, though, because it's the same trap as the Gabelle. The Salt March did not, by itself, free India. Independence came in 1947 out of many forces. A world war that gutted Britain's finances, decades of political organizing and negotiation, an empire running out of the money and the will to hold on. The march was a catalyst and a symbol, maybe the most powerful of the century. It was not a single cause, but it moved the one thing empires actually run on, which is not soldiers, its legitimacy. So look at what happened to a lump of salt. In Han China, it was a budget line, a fiscal instrument a minister defended by name in open court, because the people, as the old treatise said, could not escape it. In France, it became a boundary line, a forced purchase, a map of who was exempt and who was compelled, one stone under a collapsing throne. In West Africa, it was very nearly money, taxed coming and going, weighed against gold. The reason 3 empires grew rich on a single road. And in India, it became the one thing none of those earlier rulers ever intended it to be, because every power in this story leaned on the same fact: you cannot refuse salt. That's what made it the perfect thing to tax. The Guanzi said so 2,000 years ago: tax the thing people can't do without, and the tax collects itself. For 20 centuries, that logic ran one direction, from the state down onto the governed. And then on a beach in 1930, it ran the other way. Go back to that morning, the old man bending down at the waterline. Watch it again. And it means something it couldn't have meant in the cold open. Because the exact property that made salt the perfect thing to tax, that everyone needs it, everyone uses it, no one can do without, is the exact property that made it the perfect thing to rebel with. You cannot refuse salt, but that also means no one can be stopped from wanting it, from reaching for it, from lifting it out of their own sea. The universality cut both ways. The thing an empire taxed because no one could escape it turned out to be the thing no empire could keep from anyone. That's the whole arc, in a pinch of mud and salt. For 2,000 years, the powerful understood that the surest way to reach into every human life was to tax the one mineral no human can live without. What they never quite understood, what the salt and iron scholars and the salt smugglers and the caravan masters were all circling, is that a thing everyone needs belongs in the end to everyone, which is why it took an old man and a handful of salt to prove it. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want more stories about the objects, systems, and hidden forces that built the modern world, subscribe to the channel. The next story is already waiting. See you in the next video.